It's 12:10. Yes, you have lunch coming up, but first, you're here to learn some cool stuff and talk about some cool stuff. I like to think of this as a conversation. So I am Diane Tate. I'm going to talk about creating a strong geek culture. I've placed a quote on the cover slide to inspire you about the importance of building a strong culture, especially for developers. So just a quick bit about me, like why in the heck am I talking about this? So I work on some of this stuff at Mozilla. I'm in our internal communications group, and I work on designing programs to make our staff happy. We have a lot of developers on our staff. I used to do stuff like this at Schwab, where I worked in internal communications as well for Schwab Technology. So it's Schwab's technology organization. At the time, we had about 1,000 people in IT, and so I worked on a lot of employee programs for that. So hopefully I have some experience that will be helpful, and I'm glad everyone's here because it means that you care about culture, and that's a good thing. So let's talk about what we're talking about. So creating a strong geek culture, let's parse this out. We know that words have lots of meanings, and you can't make assumptions. So I'm going to reverse the order a little bit. So grammatically, it doesn't really make sense, but I think it'll help us to break down what we're actually looking at here. First of all, what's a geek? What's culture? What is strong? And then I think the reason you're all here is how do we create it? So first of all, a geek, I intentionally chose this word. It's a very strategic word. And I'm sort of kidding, but there's a lot of fun things out there about what is a geek, what is a nerd, what is a dork, what is a dweeb, and obviously some of these things are quite not very positive. My point in this slide is that when we're talking about designing something for an audience, it's really good to understand your audience. And for the most part, if we're at a developer conference and the audience is developers, there's a few assumptions you can make about your audience, and you can always validate and test. That's a good idea. But it's a safe assumption that your audience is very committed and very focused around solving certain problems. So if that's one sort of generalization, I would say, about addressing a developer population, it's that. Developers really care about what they do, and they really want to solve problems. So understanding that mindset's pretty important. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about cultures for those types of people. What in the heck is a culture? So there's lots of definitions. It's a little bit, you could say it's elusive. But there's some core things, core ingredients to culture that are pretty important. Ultimately, it's about the why. Why are you doing what you're doing? That has a large influence on what the culture is. So, and what the culture is really sort of the shared set of values and protocols that a group of people ascribe to and sign up for when they're working on something together or collaborating together or living together or traveling together. There's lots of different little subculture type of experiments, but typically the culture is defined by how do you collaborate, how do you communicate, what are sort of the unwritten rules around how you relate to one another. So feel squishy, super, super important, and you can actually start to codify some of these things for your organization. So even though if it might feel a bit ephemeral, you can actually codify, capture, and actually make tangible what these values are. You can put them down in writing. So there is a process that you can go through, and it's extremely helpful, and I highly recommend it. And then what's a strong culture? What does that mean? It sounds a little odd, but I think a strong culture is where people in the organization or in the community that you're working with feel empowered. So they feel like they are a critical part of that culture, and they can actually be engaged, contribute, and participate. So a lot of that is around individual work motivations. And so as much as you can have, say, autonomy in your work and contribute to the larger endeavor, the more people that feel that way and feel like they can contribute, the stronger your culture will be. So just a few kind of definitions. And I think the reason that you're all here is really like, okay, fine, like we know who we're designing for, we've talked a little about culture, but how do you make it? How do you make it good? What does that mean? So I'm just going to throw out a few things based on things in the industry, my own experience in literature. There's lots of literature on this stuff because, again, it's super important, so I'm really excited you're all here because you care about it. I'll throw out a few things. And I'm happy to chat afterwards about any of this stuff. But I would say a few key principles to get on the right foot to create a culture that you want is to start early. So even if you're a super small startup, I've already talked to some of you here that work at very small organizations, feels like a luxury to think inward when so much of your challenge is thinking outward of the market, as it should be. But to be effective in doing what you want to do, it's really important to be intentional and start early about what kind of environment do you want to create for your people. And as I was mentioning, you can start to codify some of those things. What are our values? What do we care about? So there's lots of companies in tech that have these. I mean, Atlassian in San Francisco has like 5 core values, and they're everywhere. They have codified them, and they are visually available, not only in their literature and on their website, but in their office, literally as banners. So you can capture these things, even if they aren't scientific per se. They are observable, and you can capture them. And don't wait to do it. So even if you're small, you're going to put yourself at an advantage the earlier you start to define these things. And then, and I would say, just share them and socialize them and agree on them as a group so that you can replicate that moving forward. So the earlier you do it, the better. Rewarding people for the right behaviors. So we talked about how culture is really a shared set of values and protocols for how you work together. So you might say that your culture is collaborative. You might make a decision that we want a collaborative culture, and what does that look like? Does it mean that we want consensus, or does it mean that we involve specific stakeholders for specific decisions? So you can put some boundaries on it and some definitions around that. What you really need to do is then, if you put that stake in the ground and you articulate what that is, you need to follow through and actually reward people for the behaviors that you're saying that you care about, those cultural values. So it's important to think about the how. How do people get work done? It's super easy to reward results, and obviously business is about results. We want results. But the how is just as important as the what. So if people achieve extraordinary results, but do it in a way that's completely counter to everything that you've decided is important to you as an organization, if they leave a wake in their work that is not in sync with what you say you care about, you really need to get that back in line. It's super important to follow through and make your actions in terms of what you recognize as a company, what you compensate for, and those are all ways of rewarding certain types of behavior. So it's super important to capture those and reward those behaviors you want. And I would say there's the carrot of rewards, and then certainly there's consequences. So if people behave in a way that is counter to what you're saying that your culture should be, or what you want it to be, and what you're creating it to be, then there should be consequences for that too. It's super important, and you need to think about the whole organism when you implement some of these rewards and these consequences, because it's not only about the one person, it's about all the people that they affect and they impact. So it's really the best thing that you can do is to follow through on that stuff. The third one really, I think, is particularly important to cultures with a lot of developers. Just the idea is treat your people as the intelligent, problem-solving population that they are. And usually when people want to solve problems, they like to understand how certain decisions were made. It doesn't mean that it's consensus. So transparency is a very frequently used word now. It can mean different things, but I think the one common denominator would be just making available sort of the rationale, the data, whatever it is that drove into a certain decision. It doesn't mean that you'll get agreement, but at least you're sharing sort of the approach that you took to get there. The only other thing that I would say about transparency is that making things available is not quite the same thing as transparency. So you can dump a bunch of information out there, but it doesn't mean that it's accessible per se. So the way that you are transparent is actually pretty important. The whole goal of transparency is to invite people into the process, to understand the process, to feel like they were a part of it in whatever way that was. So if you just dump a bunch of stuff out there and say, it's out there, we're being transparent, but people can't find it, then you're not really being transparent. So think through how you share information and make it accessible beyond just being available. And then, removing obstacles from getting shit done, right? So people want to solve problems, they want to ship, they want to test, they want to get stuff out the door. It's frustrating when you can't do that. If there's bureaucracy or if there's tools that aren't in place, it's super frustrating, and that can be a huge morale killer. So that's just like a very specific thing that's probably fairly universal in terms of building a healthy, vibrant working environment and culture, is just Get shit done, make it easy to get shit done, take out the obstacles to getting shit done. And then finally, distribute the relationships. This might be more applicable to some of the bigger companies that you're at, but as you put a stake in the ground and make decisions about the kinds of culture that you want, as you grow, it's very difficult to replicate that unless you distribute the responsibility. And the great thing is that as you distribute that responsibility to everybody in the organization, everyone's an owner. Everyone feels like they're a part of it because they are a part of it. And what does that look like? It could be when you hire new people into the company, instead of having a centralized orientation process, it might be giving them a buddy that was just hired a month earlier and is very sympathetic to what this new hire is going through. And then they can pass it on to the next new hire. So distribute that. Don't feel like it's a command and control kind of thing. It certainly isn't. A healthy culture can be shared and owned and driven by everybody there. So those are just some initial thoughts. I think I have some bonuses. So it's very good to know how you're doing. Are you creating a good culture? How can you know if you're on the right track? What are some key indicators? These are just a few. They're hardly prescriptive or exhaustive, but it's a good indicator of, for example, some of your meetings tend to be boom, 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 super focused, very effective, in and out, boom, you're off to do your work. That might be an indicator that people are on the same page, they're in line, there's a shared understanding of what needs to happen, communication is clear. These are all very positive indicators. On the other hand, if meetings are long, there's maybe too many people in the room, or there's not that many people in the room, then that's an indicator that maybe some of these shared understandings and protocols and ways to do things aren't really sinking in or infiltrating in the organization. So that's sort of an indicator. Another indicator is technical debt, and that's really sort of the instantiation of a culture that isn't effectively sort of digested by the organization. So technical debt is really a concept that I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with, but the whole idea of when you make shortcuts and you try to get things shipped in a limited time frame, you may not do the full amount of technical work that needs to be done to architect out a solution that has less dependencies and less bugs, for example. So the more you defer implementing the products the way that you need to for the technical architecture, the more mess you're gonna have to clean up later, right? So everyone knows what technical debt is, and there's a lot going on right now, and that's a quote from another person, Laura Thompson's a head engineer at Mozilla, and she calls technical debt an energy vampire for engineers. It just sucks the life out of you as an engineer. So additionally, there's a lot of discussion happening. Steve Blank, who writes about lean startups, and Kate Hedleston is an engineer in San Francisco. They talk a lot about team debt. So it's the analogy of if you take on too many team members and don't properly assimilate them, to use a scary word, but if you don't properly integrate them and share what those values are and get them equipped with what the goals of the organization are, then you acquire team debt. Your team can slow down. Even one member, if not properly onboarded and integrated and exposed to what your culture is and how you work, can really drag down the performance of the entire team. So that's definitely an analogy that is being used more frequently. So again, it speaks to the importance of being explicit about your values and your culture and sharing that and transmitting that to other people. Hours worked, that's another indicator. If people are spilling into they just have no work-life boundary, then it might be a good idea to check in and see, like, is this an explicit decision that we have made to meet a certain goal, or are things not quite clear in terms of, like, what is the work and the focus and the way that we're doing the work about? So if people are working crazy hours and feeling burnt out and stressed out, probably another indicator that you have work to do to really reach out and understand what the understandings are, what the expectations are throughout the organization, and maybe do a check on that, certainly if it's not an explicit decision to do so. And then there's just other metrics that a lot of organizations do look at, things like churn and retention. Those are noisy, so that's sort of like, don't necessarily look at those things because there's a lot of other factors that can go into that. The external market, did you get funding? Did you make that big sale? So there's other stuff in there that you can be doing a fantastic job at really transmitting the ideas around your culture and integrating new team members, but if there's an external external event that can mess up things like looking at your retention or your churn rates. So I would caution you to not look at those things, but maybe check out the other things as some indicators. And then, really, the only thing I would leave you with, and again, this stuff is kind of meaty, so I'm happy to talk to people over lunch, but I would just say that as we talk about indicators and how can you measure, how can you track if you're effectively building a strong culture and creating and growing that culture, is just that this stuff is hard, and it's not quite the same timeline as software development and web development. So people's motivations, behaviors, how they work together, that stuff, a lot of it's hardwired. Some of it takes a while to change. So the environment is certainly formative and influential in how people work together and how the culture evolves. But the stuff takes time. So you can't necessarily wire or architect a culture in a couple of months. It takes time. So I leave you with this quote that basically says that in science, some of the results take a generation to see, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be vigilant and you shouldn't care about it and have a method and an approach to building it, because it is likely one of the most important things you can be investing your time and energy if you want to build a sustainable organization over time. So I think that's it. That's all I got. I finished early, so thanks. That it? Oh, yeah. There's some goodies for you, and I will post these on SlideShare and tweet it out as well, but there's some links for better understanding drill downs of some of the stuff that I shared as well. So thanks a lot. Questions? I'm down for that. Yeah, we got 3 minutes. Go for it. Yeah, at the last Forward.js, I gave a talk on working remotely. I can tweet it out again. Is there a specific question that you have, or?
Can you still build the risks that you see?
Right, so the question is, can you build a strong culture with remote teams? What are the risks? So simply, yes, you can, and there are risks, and it can be harder. So you need to be even more intentional, I think, when your team is very distributed about how you communicate and how you set up expectations about how the teams collaborate and work together. You can be extremely explicit about, like, listen, I'm going to be available on this channel from these hours to these hours and come to certain agreements, but it takes more work. If you just bump into someone and visually see them, there's visual cues. You don't have to work on when you're going to grab that person. When you're remote, obviously, you don't have the same kinds of cues. So you need to be extremely intentional and think through that. And there's nothing that really quite replaces a face-to-face meeting. So just using the example of Mozilla, Mozilla is a very distributed organization. We have over 1,000 staff across, I think, 11 offices, and at least those many time zones, because a lot of people work in their homes, so we're a great example. And we bring together regularly face-to-face. We think that's super important to do as an organization. WordPress, some of the other Buffer, some other very remote distributed organizations also believe in the value of face-to-face. And so I think the analogy there is sort of like you can build a machine and put fuel in the machine through all your communications channels, whether it's Slack or IRC, but you got to jumpstart that relationship, that foundation of trust through the face-to-face interactions. It's really critical. Yes?
Face-to-face is virtual sufficient?
No, I mean like face-to-face. So Mozilla, we do video calls all the time. But then when we get together, so we're looking at each other remotely, but it's extremely different when you're in person because there's a lot of ancillary conversations and things just come up outside of the confines of a 30-minute face-to-face stare at the camera where you feel like you need to stick to an agenda or you're being disrespectful of the person's time or whatever that looks like. So it's amazing how much more information can be gleaned in just relationship building and trust building. Anyone else? All right, thank you. Cool. I'll go now.